Welcome to the ClassCast Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. Today, we're speaking with Craig Randall, the author and inventor of trust-based observations. Craig's a school administrator with a really interesting experience across a lot of different schools and a lot of different places. And he's come up with an idea for how to improve teacher observations so that, well, I guess we'll let you explain it, but it sounds like it's a little more streamlined for the administrator and maybe a little more focused on growth for the teacher. And I think that those are important ideas because we're always talking about observations and improving the quality of instruction. And so if there's a way to improve the process, we should certainly want to do that. I'm currently in the middle of my formal evaluation year. Every 3 years we do that. And so I'm right in the middle of it. So I'm looking forward to hearing some great ideas so I can tell my principal how to give me better grades. So Craig, thank you for joining us. How you doing?
Thanks for having me on, Ryan. I'm doing great, although it's raining cats and dogs in Washington State and has been for days. I'm getting tired of it.
Yeah, I bet. We, here in Northern Virginia, we've had high winds for about a week and a half. And so all of my backyard furniture is scattered around the yard. I figure I'm not even picking it up until it dies down. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you get to complain about the rain in Washington State. So
I'm doing it anyway.
Yeah. Hey, that's fair. That's fair. So normally we get started sort of talk about your experience in education. And so I want to do that kind of quickly because you just mentioned you're in Washington State, but I know that you've worked all over the world. And I think that that's also another thing that we maybe want to get into here. But just real quick, thinking back to your experience as a student, how did that go? What kind of student were you in elementary, middle, high school, through college? What did you study? How was your experience from the student side of education?
Sure. Well, I was a rule follower and I was quiet and shy, and especially in early elementary school. And so I did well and I performed well, and was probably praised for that and didn't really have to work that hard at it. But I think when it came to junior high, when homework really started, I could still get by and get B's and, the occasional C without doing homework, but I never really learned how to study, I don't think. And I don't think my parents really forced us to study or whatever. We'd get lectures when we got in trouble, when we got those C's. And I do remember though, having doing homework and things that didn't come easily, like having anxiety and a lot of times just quitting because I didn't really know how to deal with that anxiety. And then I'd say through the junior high and high school, I was really shy. And so it was hard being a quiet, shy kid. And I will say though, that between my junior and senior year, my sister transferred to the local Catholic school and I would have been a senior. And so she was going to be a sophomore. So it made sense for her. And I approached my parents and said, I'd like to make a change too. And they were like, really? And I said, yeah. And so that actually turned out to be one of the best things schooling wise I did, was giving myself a fresh start and a chance to, because you're kind of pigeonholed as a shy guy. How do you change that? And it gave me a chance to, and I still have some friends from high school from way back then, from that new school. And then, so anyway, on to college. And I would say my parents were really strict. And so when the freedoms of university took over, I overindulged. And so my first year of university was particularly bad and ended up with about half the credits I should have. And then my dad did a good thing and said, well, you can pay for school. And if you get a 3-point or higher, I'll reimburse you. And so then I started to do better in school miraculously and didn't really know what I wanted to do. My dad was a CPA, thought I'd go into that until I realized I had no desire to do that, and ended up doing a lot of drama and English, but got my degree in English. And then went and got I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I had an uncle that was an elementary school counselor, and he said, hey, you want to see what I do? And teaching wasn't really appealing to me at that point. And I said, sure. And I just loved the way he was working with kids and making a difference. And he's putting out fires and there's sort of some action, which seemed kind of fun in a weird way. And so then I started my master's and got my master's in counseling and then started my career in that. And then, if you want me to keep going.
Yeah, well, so I'll jump in just because that's great, and that's like a quick hitter. That was really good. Thinking about that experience, obviously we want to lead into your work as an administrator. there's something you said in there that I think resonates a little bit, because I talk with my students about this a lot, that when you go to school, K through 12 with the same people, I always tell them, because I teach mostly juniors and seniors, like high school English. And I tell them, I say, guys, who you are is not necessarily who a lot of your classmates think you are. And I said, one of the cool things here is I don't know most of you. So when I read your writing, when I see what's going on, like, I may talk to you in ways that your classmates don't, but it's because I don't have that background. And I always say that's one of the coolest parts about going to college or going into the military, or even, if you're going to get a job, just try to get a job where it's not with the same people, because you get to just be you now. There's not that remnant of, oh, he's the quiet kid from sixth grade, or she's the girl who peed her pants in third grade. Like, there is none of that baggage. Like, all that stuff's gone, And so, and it is really nice to be able to reinvent yourself, or even if not reinvent, just sort of be who you are now. Yeah. Without the rest of that coming with you. In terms of, maybe some of the struggles, either with maybe being shy or thinking about, the beginning of college and dealing with the freedom. And I know how that one goes. I actually had the reverse. My parents were very kind of permissive. And so I got to college and there was an RA 3 doors down. And I was like, oh man, this guy's always watching me, and everybody else is going crazy. I'm like, God, that guy's right there. He's way more strict than my parents. Like, what are you guys doing? So I had almost the reverse. I almost calmed it down for a little bit. But thinking about that from that student perspective, when you go into school counseling, how much of your personal experience sort of informed the way you worked with and talked with kids? Like, obviously that gives you some kids you can identify with a little bit. Are those experiences you shared with students when you talk with them?
Yeah. I'll say that most of my work was elementary and middle school. And so, depending on how young they are, you can't really have some of those conversations, right, because they're just not there. But I would say the empathy for kids that struggled, and no matter what their struggle was, whether it was a tough family situation or their behavior issues or they were picked on or whatever. I just think maybe being a kid where that parts of school weren't so easy for me for whatever reason, I felt like I just naturally had empathy for all those kids, and that worked with them. And then I would say the kids that, like, especially more the middle school or upper elementary, when there was homework and that were struggling with that, I think my own experiences with that definitely factored into my work counseling. And then I'd say even more when I became a principal with those kids, because I was that kid. And so some of the tips and ways that I was able to support them, definitely I would talk about that. And I've been there, you're me. And I think sometimes kids don't think that your principal or your counselor was anything other than a perfect person as a child, and we all know we weren't. So it made a difference, I think.
And I think that's really important, not to knock anyone who was a great student and knew in high school that they wanted to be a teacher, and, like, that's great. And that works. I just think that sometimes if you always liked school and you're always pretty good at it, sometimes it's hard for those teachers to connect to the kids who are not into school, and I don't want to overgeneralize. Some teachers do a great job of it, but I think that there's a lot of people who are, who are good teachers and who have been good students, but they never saw themselves doing anything other than school. And so when you get a kid who just hates being there and they don't want to be there and they don't want to do the work, I think that sometimes that's harder to make that connection or to find a way to help the kid when you yourself have had some kind of struggle, whether it was socially, academically. I think it makes it a little easier to bridge the gap and bring that kid into the fold in the classroom. Not that we want to, hire all kinds of people who are just, miscreants and delinquents and whatever else, but I think there's a place for that on every staff, well, it's more of myself than anyone there, but you gotta have some balance. And I think that's important. Now you got into counseling and then eventually into administration. Did you teach at any point? Like, were you in the classroom, or were you counselor straight to admin?
No, not at all. So my career was very eclectic. And so after the counseling, as we do, I coached. And I coached basketball, and I would do summer camps. And there was this traveling summer point guard camp called the Point Guard College, which was amazing. And through that, I got to know some college coaches that would come to some of these camps in the summer. And I had an opportunity then presented itself for an opening as an assistant at a small college to be a basketball coach. So I detoured for 7 years into small college basketball coaching. And then my wife and I after that. And so then when you're doing that, like, you teach too, like either I was subbing at a season or I'm teaching classes at the college. And so then my wife and I decided that we'd always had this dream to work at international schools. And so we were closing in on 40 and thought, wow, it's not that I think that way now, but now 40, wow, now or never. And with hindsight, I don't see it that way. But anyway, so we ended up going to a job fair and we were offered jobs. And so I was offered a teaching job. And so I taught overseas. Our first place was in Warsaw. And then I started my administrative credentials at home in the summers and a little bit of online, and then moved on to administration from there. So yeah, I did teach as well, which I'm really glad for.
Yeah. And that's always one that, in Virginia, I think it used to be, I don't think you have to anymore. It used to be that you had to teach for, I think it was 3 years before you could move into administration. And then at some point, and I could be wrong, so if anyone's listening and knows this, please obviously tell me. But then they opened it up that you could have counseling experience and to go into administration, but you didn't have to teach first. And now I think there's still some requirement for classroom experience, but it's a lot less than maybe it was 15, 20, 25 years ago. And so I always think, not that you have to be a great teacher to be a great principal, but I always feel like you have to have that experience, or you should have the experience. It's really hard to, especially say in the role of being an evaluator, it's hard to evaluate someone else when maybe you haven't done it. You don't necessarily have to have been great at it. You think about a lot of NFL coaches, say NBA coaches were good players. Most of them weren't great. And so their job is now to evaluate and instruct people who are essentially better than them, but who maybe don't know it better than them, right? Yep. But if they'd never played at all, it's a tough sell. I mean, even if you have the right idea, you have the right information, I think sometimes people balk at the idea of taking advice or feedback from someone who they don't feel like has done that job, and so for you, both having taught, having counseled, having coached, I think coaching is also really important in building sort of your leadership style. So I'm sure that factors in. It sounds like you've sort of put together a sort of a package deal as a career leading into that administration role. You should have a pretty good sense of how all the different pieces are working. Is that how it felt to you? Like when you got into administration, did you feel that you were well prepared in those ways, or like what's that transition?
I did.
Like?
I mean, I don't think I certainly at the time didn't realize that. I mean, I never even thought I'd be a principal, but in hindsight, I mean, I look at the principal as instructional coach in a lot of ways too. And so then the counseling and the empathy in terms of building trust and relationships, and then the experience of teaching for better and worse, and all the experiences that we go through with that, they definitely played a factor in the package that I became as a principal, which eventually became trust-based and all that, for sure.
Yeah. So aside from maybe a little wanderlust and looking to just do something different, what was the appeal to international schools? Or maybe a better question is, you did it once, you went to Warsaw, you did it, but I looked up your, looked at your bio. I was looking through the information, like you've been all over, right? You were in East or Southeast Asia. You were in the Middle East, even. Yep. So beyond maybe that first experience or two, what made you keep with it? What about international teaching or administrating, kept you coming back?
Lots of things. I mean, there's the challenge of it, and so there's difficulties, but there's also, there's a romance to it, and there's excitement whenever you go to a new place and you begin to learn that culture. And of course, that'll wear off as frustrations with language and everything. You just become part of your daily life too. But I'd say that, certainly the travel opportunities, the places that you're able to go for holiday are absolutely amazing. The people you meet, if you think as adults, we don't meet as many people that become our friends, right? After a certain age, we have our friends. And every time you go to a new school, your coworkers become your friends and your family in a way. So the opportunity to get to meet new people that sort of become your family, that's really exciting. I have so many dear friends from our time there. I'd say financially, in most of the schools, it's pretty good because your housing is taken care of, your flight, and certainly once you get admin, oftentimes a car and other things like that. And so you're able to save some money, which is really nice. And so all those things together just let's go try something new. But then also part of it was like going from teaching to admin, you become an assistant principal, and then from an assistant principal, you want to become, and so oftentimes you have to move to make that next step. So that probably facilitated some of the moves.
Yeah.
In addition.
Yeah, I have a couple of friends who have taught overseas. Only one that I can think of. I'm sure there's more than one, but one off the top of my head who I know went and taught for, I think maybe 2 years in, I don't remember. Might have been United Arab Emirates. But it was a year or two. I know some people who sort of did the less formal piece where they were there as like an English teacher
Yeah.
tutor, but not necessarily as a fully accredited teacher. And but all of them sort of share some of those same experiences. But what is the list? Where have you been? Just since we're talking about all the places you've gone, I'm sure some listeners are like, so what are we
So
talking about
Warsaw,
here?
Poland. And I'll just tell you, I always say about Poland, any country that has beer gardens on their bike paths is a good country to live. And so, and then we lived in South Korea, and we lived in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, which was quite an experience. And we lived in Abu Dhabi and then Brazil.
Okay, awesome. So you're all over the place there. Is there a favorite in terms of the place, not the school, but as a place, just geographically, what did you like best?
I would say that two really. So, I mean, Warsaw, like I said, it has that old town, the classic old town, even though you don't think of Warsaw that way necessarily, it does have that. And so that was just absolutely fantastic. And then travel from there and the people. But in terms of just the people overall, the warmth of the people, for sure, Brazil.
Yeah.
And the city we lived in, people would from other parts of Brazil would say, "Oh, those people are cold." And I was like, "If that's cold, I can't even imagine how warm everyone is everywhere else." So
that is, I think, the most consistent thing I've heard about Brazil is that some of the friendliest people in the world. Like you go and it's hard not to have fun or to feel like people are there, sort of taking care of you, or
they care. Yeah,
that's awesome. So yeah, I mean, I always say I want to travel more, and at this point, I'm waiting for kids to get a little bit older. But maybe this is a sneaky way to do it on somebody else's dime a little bit. That's
we started actually when our kids have twins, and so the year they started kindergarten was the year we did it, and it turned out being pretty good.
Yeah, that's awesome. So as an administrator, when you move from the classroom and into the role of leadership, and whether you want to think about that first job as an assistant principal or as the full principal, what is your philosophy for leadership in a school?
Well, I would say when I started my admin program, that's when I met my first true mentor. And I remember feeling frustrated with the observation process prior to that, like as experientially. And I actually went through a period of 2 years where I wasn't observed at all, which is more common than you might think. And so I started taking a class from this guy who he walked the talk, and he was just instantly saying, you have to be in classes every day. You have to be observing teachers. You have to be giving them feedback. You have to be supporting them. You have to be helping them grow. And that just resonated with me. And we took a supervision class with him. And in that class, we would do mock lessons. So we'd have to bring a 10-minute lesson every class, really be prepared to teach it. And then one of us would take turns observing that person. And then we would immediately do a reflective conversation. Then the whole class would reflect on that whole process. And so it was absolutely amazing. And he anchored it, and this still anchors trust-based observations today. He anchored it by asking the first two questions, which were, what were you doing to help students learn? And then if you had it to do over again, what, if anything, might you do differently? And so if we contrast that with the standard model where we have a pre-conference and then we go and I observe, and then we have a follow-up conference where I basically tell you what your ratings were on all these areas and hopefully give you a few compliments and then tell you what you ought to get better at. All of a sudden, it's about you, the teacher, not about me, the principal. And so that just changes the whole dynamic of it. And so we did that so much that I just instantly felt ready to be a principal and ready to go in and do classes. And I felt instantly that that was the most powerful way to affect teaching and learning growth in the school. So I guess my philosophy was driven by that experience, is like get into classes and do that. And I was really lucky because the principal of that school, he'd had a whole career in the US, and sort of as his retirement went and became a principal at an international school. I mean, he worked hard, so I don't want you to think that, but he just wanted to do something new.
Right.
But he was at a point in his career where what really excited him was having someone young and enthusiastic as his assistant principal. And so that was definitely me. And so I would bring ideas up to him, and he would just always say, well, it help kids, tell me how. And so I told him about this idea from my program. I've been doing 3 20-minute observations per day. And he said, great. And he actually started doing it too. And then I think my philosophy really developed as I started doing it and seeing how teachers responded to it. And then the other thing I'll say is, when you start going into classes that much, there's so much amazing teaching going on that if we're not in classes a lot, we just don't see that. And so then, not that I didn't already respect teachers, but the amazing stuff I would see, just my esteem for them just grew so much more. And so anyway, we'd go and I'd do these observations, and then we'd come back and the next day ask these questions. And then teachers, first off, they responded so well to the questions. They were like saying, this is the first time it's ever been about me. This is the first time I've ever been asked questions. People that sometimes have been teaching for 20 years. And so you could just tell from the positive reaction, like that something about that was really magical. And so the next step then normally would be to get feedback, right? But so a couple things factored into my having anxiety about giving feedback right away. I would say one is the new guy wanting to be liked. And then two, I'm brand new. I don't know you. So I felt like it was sort of arrogant for me to start giving you feedback on something when I've just barely seen you. What if I offered you feedback on something? Because think how rarely we actually see you, at most 1% of the time of your teaching, that you're really good at. I just didn't happen to see it. And so I didn't get feedback. And instead what I did, and we scripted back then, is I would just share the evidence of good practice that I saw, but there were no ratings attached to it. I just saw this, I noticed this. And teachers responded incredibly well to that too. Sometimes they'd be embarrassed, but they were always happy to have, and they would say the same kind of things. Wow, I've never had any, but thank you for noticing that. And which is kind of a sad statement on the current, maybe general state of observations and evaluations. And then maybe the most magical thing of it all happened is because I waited, teachers would start saying, so I'm going like 2-3 visits for sure. And teachers are starting to say, okay, but what can I get better at? And so those somehow something clicked that because I'd asked questions, so I made it about them. I'd shared what I noticed, which was also about them. And I didn't pass any judgment. I just did that. Somehow trust developed. And so they felt comfortable and safe enough to ask me what they could get better at. And so really, ever since then, it's just been about what's the best way to improve teaching and learning. And that process has turned out to be what's been most effective.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I mean, I think anybody who just listened to that explanation hears that all of that was about supporting the teachers and supporting the students. I mean, I've only worked for a handful of principals, but you have, there's definitely different styles. You have the authoritarian, you have somebody, you can be the micromanager, you can have people who just sort of disappear for long periods of time and you don't even know where they are half the time. I had a principal in time. He was a great guy, but he was the cool principal, which was great, except that when a kid actually did, like, you needed the discipline piece, it's tough to get that out of the cool principal sometimes. And so, I mean, the goal should always be growth, and but it's a double-edged sword, and I think you just talked about that pretty nicely. How too much sort of constructive feedback, too much of try this, do this next time, starts to feel a little heavy-handed. It starts to feel a little oppressive. Not enough, and I don't know the point of the evaluation. I think as the state of Virginia redid some of the standards a few years ago, that teachers are now evaluated a little differently, and then each county got to put their own little sort of spin on it, but the basic thing stays the same. But I remember going a period of time, I'm in my 15th year teaching right now, and I want to say it was maybe around year, I don't know, 8 to 10 or 8 to 12, I don't know, somewhere in there, where, people would pop in and observe, and sometimes they do a little write up and sometimes not. And in the end, I think I went maybe 3 or 4 years without ever hearing something I should try to do. I mean, it's great. I mean, don't get me wrong. I already have a very big head, I have a very strong neck. It's good, And so when somebody shows up and says, hey, you're doing all this stuff great, I'm like, well, thank you. I know, but at the same time, if you're going to come in, we're going to do this. I would love to hear some ideas that I might try. I may in the end choose not to do it, and I hopefully nobody gets too upset if it just doesn't work. Sometimes it doesn't fit your class, your style, but I'd still like to have the option. I'd like to hear it. And if in the end I have a reason that I'm not going to do that or it's not going to work, if everything else is going well, hopefully we can respectfully disagree, but I'd still like to hear it. And I think more often than not, you get good feedback and you do it. I start with I might not do it, but the reality is most of the time you're going to do it. You're going to try it. You're going to say, hey, a person who knows what they're doing just said, hey, here's some feedback. I think that depending on how that's communicated, I'd like to say that most teachers want more of that, not that they necessarily want the administrator in the room all the time or anything, but if in the end it's actually improving
feedback,
practice,
it's different.
Yeah.
And if there's trust in a safe environment, then it's a different story. So like one of the things that we've created over time, I created an observation template, and it's smaller, and it's only got 9 areas of pedagogy in it. And of course we leave some out with that, but the research says anything more than 10 and observers start to lose the forest through the trees. They're so busy looking for things to check off that they're not actually paying attention to the teaching. But we have on the template, we have a 10th thing, and it's not really anything we're looking for. It's actually there for the observers to remind themselves to tell the teachers this all the time. And it's risk-taking innovation. And so one of the things that's really important is to tell the teachers that, look, if I come into your classroom and you're trying something new and it completely bombs, rest assured the next day you're going to get a congratulatory fist bump for taking risks, because that will lead to growth eventually, for sure. And so along with that, then when it does come time to offer feedback, it has to be not just, hey, here's something for you to think about. Like if I'm going to choose to offer you feedback, it has to be supported. And so actually on the observation template for each area of pedagogy, we've listed toolbox possibilities. So what are the bunch of different strategies that you could have? And so one that helps me as an observer to be more specific in the language I'm using. But then we've also created web links. So that'll lead to articles or books or videos that can help them to get better at that. And even if that's not where I'm going to go, if I'm going to prepare to offer a suggestion to you, then I want to be prepared to, maybe it's pairing you with another teacher that's really expert at that. Or maybe that's being prepared to send you at a conference. So it's not just say, hey, here's something to try. It's here's something to try, and here are some options for how we can potentially get better at it. And then I'm going to add something else to what you said is then, like if you're a strong teacher and you're coming in and being observed a lot, it's definitely good to get good feedback. But if I'm in your classes a lot, I'm also noticing that you're really good at something. So then I can also tap into your strengths to lead professional development to help all my other teachers get better too.
Yeah, well, and that's true. You always want to use the resources in the school. One, it's cost effective, and two, it builds maybe good relationships between the people in the building because you sort of form that network of support.
John Hattie, collective teacher efficacy, right? It's
He's actually he was a favorite. What he just published or as part of the new distance learning stuff. Yep. And I think he actually came and presented in my county, maybe at my school a while back. And so, there's a lot of different ways to approach this. And I think the focus on growth is important. I'm curious though, because one of the premises that we're dealing with right now is that we're assuming that we're seeing things that we're impressed by, we're seeing some innovation, you're trying these things. How do you handle when you're dealing with a teacher who just really isn't good at it? And sure. I'll preface this with my idea, because you might disagree, and that is perfectly fine to do so. But I think that it's one of the, you can take an average teacher and help them to be good. You can help a good teacher to get a little better. I don't know if you can teach a person to be a great teacher. You can give them the methods, right? I think that there's certain parts of this job, and everyone does it differently, whether it's sort of an acting thing, it's a sales thing, it's a content mastery, great at connecting with the kids. There's different ways to do that. I'm not sure that you can take a person, who's not real good, kind of on the lower end, and get them up to good. Maybe. I don't know how often we take someone who's terrible and get them to functional. And I think it might be even harder to take someone who's just sort of functional and help them to be great. Now that happens, but I think that happens over a longer period of time where they learn, they develop a style, right? And so in terms of the evaluation, the feedback, the learning piece, how do you see those extremes working, right? Because I personally don't think you can take the terrible teacher. Some people just can't do this job really well. And so that's got to be a hard conversation. Agreed. And then I think that there are people who are good, but may never be great. And while you never want to say cut your losses, at what point from that perspective do you ever say, well, this is good enough? Not that you stop giving the feedback, but, at how hard do you push, say, a teacher in either direction? When do you cut losses on the bad teacher? When do you recognize that the good teacher isn't going to be great? Or am I wrong about all that because my job is not evaluating other teachers?
No, I think everything you're saying has validity. So I'm going to start out with a couple of things. So one, let's just talk about the current model, right? And I don't think I need to go into it. We all kind of know what it is. But But the research on it is that what we're doing right now isn't working. Like the Gates Foundation put in 7 years and $200 million into in an effort to improve the quality of teaching, student learning outcomes, and graduation rates through the development of a more robust observation evaluation process. 7 years, $200 million, no sustained improvement. So let's start with that baseline that what we're seeing right now isn't really improving teaching and learning. And so then one of the reasons why is that this man named Matt O'Leary out of Great Britain, who to me is the predominant researcher in observation and evaluation in the world, his qualitative research says that as soon as we start to evaluatively rate teachers, their pedagogy, they start playing it safe and stop taking risks and stop with innovation and creativity because, frankly, your job's on the line. So what if I, like my example of fist bump after a bomb, if that's not going to be the case in a lot of scenarios, and that's not there. So let's look at that scenario. Like those are some of the baselines that we have. And so in trust-based observations, you still have to evaluate. That's never going to be a part of the job that you can get away with. For decades, since the 60s, people have been saying that as long as we're doing these two things, they're counter to each other. But all we've done for the last 50 years is continue to do the same things, like observe for growth and observe for evaluation. And so what trust-based observations has tried to do is figure out how do we make that still work in a way that they're not as counter to each other. So I think professionalism, like am I getting my stuff done, is a fair thing to evaluate in any job. I think collegiality and collaboration, especially in the world of education, is a fair thing to evaluate. And because if you have problems with that, that's going to cause problems in your whole building, right? Mm-hmm. And then I think planning and preparation. Those are just things that have to be done in any job. And so we've taken out the evaluation of pedagogy. And so basically what we've done then is we've talked about supported opportunities for growth. And so we've created what we call professional development communities. And so we tie in like one annual action research big goal. Teachers, even though we don't rate the pedagogy, there's still a rated rubric that teachers can use for their own self-analysis. And they do that at the beginning of the year to help guide what area they want to grow in. And so they target that in terms of their action research goal. And then for each one of those 9 areas on the rubric, we've created professional development communities taught or led by our in-house experts. And so then every month, a teacher who's chosen a goal gets to go and work in this community. And then one of the other questions that we added to the observation form was, how's your action research goal going? And so we're able to talk about it every month. And so basically by doing that, what we're really hoping to foster is a growth mindset with people that are willing to be risk takers. And so what we've done instead is, instead of evaluating pedagogy, we evaluate mindset, but with the sense that really we've set you up to be proficient just by following the system. Okay, so that's how we take care of it. Now, having what you're saying, one, I think we want to assume lifelong learning. And so we always want to keep trying and aiming towards success, even if sometimes we know it's going to be an uphill battle. And I would say, also when we look at teaching, I mean, if you were to, I hate to do this, but if you were to throw it like that's an A or a B or a C teacher, sometimes somebody that's an A teacher might not be the best team player. So are they really an A teacher? Or somebody that maybe is a B teacher is so involved in so many extra things that does that really make them an A teacher, right? So we have to evaluate everything that a teacher brings to the table, to me, if we're looking at what really makes a good teacher. For me, there's certain red flags. Like if you can't get along with others, that's going to be a problem. If we've set you up for growth mindset and you're resistant to even doing those things, that's going to be a problem. And then maybe the biggest experiential piece with evaluation that I've seen is when a teacher, after a number of visits and a time for action or improvement is suggested to them, and they'll say, okay. But then when you talk to them about what they want to work on, they choose something else. Like there's almost this disconnect in my experience between their own experience and what they're hearing.
If they're not seeing it. They're not, yeah. Lack of self-awareness, maybe.
No. And so in those situations, those are the ones that almost always end up where you don't not go through the path of occasionally having to go on an action plan. And if that doesn't work, having to take the next steps beyond that, just because it's called trust-based observations. And frankly, I'll say when there are those teachers, especially the ones that are maybe more difficult, and you do take that action, my experience is that the majority of teachers in the building respect you more because they see it and they know it and they hear about it too. So we can work to improving teachers. And so where do you and where don't you draw the line? It's an individual situation, but that's something that in my experience, either I can't get along with people, I'm difficult, or I'm just, there's that disconnect between their view of practice and their real practice.
Right. And I think, it's obviously anecdotal and limited to my personal experiences, but I think that a lot of times people who have those struggles find their own way out of the classroom, there's a relatively high teacher turnover rate and very high in some areas. And I think that there's a lot of reasons, and sometimes it's difficulty with the job, it's pay, there's a lot of reasons, but I do think that sometimes the people who are the least fit for the job find their own way out. I just always think, what do we do when we don't, or when they don't, and that's a tough spot to be in as an administrator. It's a tough spot to be in, say, as a teacher, I work, down the hall or around the corner from this person. I hear what's going on in there. I hear what the kids are saying. Like, it's, I always think of this as the analogy, when people talk about police officers and they say, well, it's just a couple bad apples. And, I say, yeah, but, the finish the phrase, a couple bad apples spoil the barrel, and you got to figure out a way to do it. And they say, well, why don't some more officers speak up? And I say, well, think back to when you were in high school. And people go, what do you mean? I say, think back to when you were in high school. You had a couple bad teachers, right? They go, yeah. And I said, you think the other teachers were like rolling to the principal's office, ratting them out every week? I go, probably not. I go, well, it's the same thing. It's a public trust issue, and it's a difficult thing to do. I'm curious because you talked a lot about the professionalism pieces, the being a part of the school community, both through, whether it's coaching or clubs or the other services that we provide in the school, and then working well with the other teachers. You say you've taken the pedagogy piece out. What does that mean? And I'm not asking you to reveal your whole rubric.
No, that's fine.
But what does that mean if you don't evaluate pedagogy? How does that work?
I'm just not assigning ratings to it. That's the part that causes people to freeze up and to stop taking risks. If I come into your classroom and then after I watched you and then I give you these 1 to 4 ratings and all these different things, and then I offer a suggestion, how supported are you really going to feel? How much are you really going to feel that statement about making a mistake, trying something new is really going to be okay? And so if that's the part that's not working, let's just not do that. We can still, and like we said, teachers can rate themselves on it at the beginning and the end of the year for self-assessment. And really, like Danielson, when she first created her framework, it wasn't intended as an evaluation tool. It was intended as a tool for teachers for their own personal growth. And then really, if you look at the history, it wasn't long after No Child Left Behind that all of a sudden that became a rubric for a way to supposedly improve the quality of teaching and learning. And going back even further, in 1983, the report A Nation at Risk came out on the so-called dire state of education, which wasn't really an accurate report. It's just that so many more kids were staying in school that if you have everyone staying in school, your scores aren't going to go up at the same level as they were before.
Just real quick, data-wise, that's always what people say. Look at what's happened to, schools since we've gotten the Federal Department of Education. And I'm like, yeah, look, I have problems with them too, but let's be realistic. What they're really saying is that we need to serve everyone in the school and every kid gets tested. So when you give every kid the test, when you track every kid's graduation rate, of course those numbers are going to shift over time. I think a lot of that big data is suspect, and not that it's gathered poorly necessarily, but the interpretation piece has to be done very carefully. And when you get your education news from a mainstream media outlet, from a journalist who doesn't specialize in education, I would just tell people to be very, very cautious, because there's always a lot of context that is usually left out. Like you point out, 1983, there's been a lot of shifts from the late 70s and the early 80s. That's maybe a bad way to look at our education system overall. Not that we shouldn't look at the data, but thinking about how those shifts affected the instructional piece, affected the evaluation, big picture, Do you think we do this better? Because if you read the history of public education in the United States for the last 120 years, evaluation seems to always be a concern, and both teachers don't always love it. And then people doubt, the quality or the effect of it. Do you think it's getting better mainstream, or do you think we're just sort of treading water and it's the same thing a different way? Like, are we actually doing any of this better, say, since you got into education?
Teaching?
Well, evaluating teaching. I mean, I think,
No, I don't think evaluating. I mean, that's why I wrote it, because I just felt like what it wasn't working. And more than anything, I didn't know I was going to write a book. I didn't know I was creating something new. It all was just accidental. And then when I was in Brazil, the head of school said, Craig, I'd like you to show the other principals what you're doing. And I was like, oh, wow, cool, thanks. And so we would meet every week and talk about observation and work on it together. And then one of the elementary principal actually a couple months later said, Craig, you need to protect your work. And I said, what? He's like, no, this is really good. And I never thought about it before. And then that led to presenting, and then led to writing an article, and then led to a book. So I know that. And then along the way, I found this research that backed up that there are things that are getting in the way of improving. Like I said, that Gates study says it's not working. So, if we think about teachers and why we got into education to make a difference in the lives of young people. I sure hope that's why everybody's gotten into education. I'm in
it for the money.
Okay, yeah, right. Exactly. I hear you, big guy. I hear you. And so if what we're doing isn't working, and we think about why, if people get into it because they want to make a difference, they have big hearts. And so then, but if we're tackling it through this very left-brained, logical, sequential, here's these 60 indicators that I'm going to rate you on, that's not going to work with those people to motivate them to get better. We want to create conditions where people, think about teacher observation. There's no other job in the world that I know of that is as vulnerable for your observation evaluation process. Nobody walks into a Starbucks, the manager of a Starbucks pulls in his laptop, sits down behind the counter for an hour and watches the barista make espresso, and then rates them on 20, 30, 40 different categories. And that's where your job sits. And so if that's the model that it is, then we have to have empathy for how vulnerable and frightening that is. And then we have to think, what are the conditions that are going to help people to take risks? Because that's how we get better. The old way is inhibiting risk taking. And like Simon Sinek says, without trust, there is no risk taking. And I'm paraphrasing, but so then let's create conditions of trust. So even to that, the model has it. So obviously it's about empathy and care and the tone of voice and using our emotional intelligence, but everything else is geared towards trust too, like the empowering teachers to lead professional development communities, but even the reflective conversation, because that's where the magic happens and that's where the relationships are built. We have those conversations in the teacher's room, because really whether I'm 8 or 15 or 35, going to the principal's office still feels like going to the principal's office. So if I can do it in your space, you're going to feel more comfortable. And then even then, instead of sitting across from you, because there is a power differential with my job title versus your job title, if I sit across from you, that amplifies that. So instead, we call for sitting beside the teacher. And then we have our rubric. And so when we're asking those questions, they can see. And so we ask them how they feel about it. And is that good? Is there anything else to add? And so all of those little elements, along with the questions, it being about you, right? Instantly, these are the strengths I see and noticed. It's about you. All those together build trust. So then teachers will take risks. And obviously there's teachers that innovate and take risks right now, but there's a lot that don't, that could if we change the way we do it.
Yeah. And I think that's great, because a big part of the evaluation, even with the way, say, I'm being evaluated now, and I forget when Virginia updated, I'm going to call it 5 years ago. I'm not sure exactly, but it becomes like you check the box or not. Like there aren't numeric ratings. It's I saw this, you're doing this, or you're not doing it, or not doing it to an acceptable level. But even in that, because you're never going to see all those things in one lesson or in 2 lessons, some of it comes down to a discussion of, well, how are you doing it in the days when I'm not there? And, I always think about how much of this is subjective, and as an English teacher, like I do more subjective grading than probably anybody in the building. And I always tell students, like today literally was the first time I used this in an AP English class. I said, guys, like you just have to trust me on this one. Like we have the rubric and all the rest, but if you really read it carefully, I can check any box on it. Like we can interpret any way we want. And I want to be honest with you about that. I want to know that I'm going to grade to your benefit, but I also need to give you feedback, and the grade needs to be accurate to the quality of your work. So when you look at this, if you have questions, we can meet and go over it. But if you look at it and you say, well, that's in the ballpark, then try not to nickel and dime me on the 1 point to 2 points, because in the end, I just need you to trust me, right? And that's a big part of it because it's subjective. I think that a lot of that factors in school evaluate or teacher evaluations, maybe more so than in other jobs. Now, I mean, there's some jobs where, it's going to happen, but even in, say, a sales job, a lot of business office jobs, there's a productivity number, there's something that we can measure. And yes, with teachers, we can measure test scores, but there's so many different things that influence test scores, especially if you're only testing the kids, every 3 years or something. Like the subjectivity part's difficult to overcome and potentially leads to failures in the data. If the teacher trusts the administrator and vice versa, I think that helps, but it doesn't remove the subjectivity. It just helps to say we're on the same page when we're making these judgment calls. Do you think that that's safe? Like, is there a way to quantify it? Is teaching a manufacturing process, or is it a craft? Is it an art?
It's all of that. I mean,
how does that work?
I mean, and I don't think you can remove that. And look, if what are we really testing right now? We're testing literacy and math, and that's it. And we talk about like what are workplace skills, whether you call them soft skills or who's the middle school guy that you had?
Joe Pizzo, power skills. I love that.
Power skills. I love that Joe terminology.
Pizzo, that was
right?
Great.
And so, but we're not testing that. And really, shouldn't we be testing that more than anything? And I know, how do you test that even? Because that's probably why they call it soft, because it's harder to measure that, right? And so it is really complicated. And I think whatever we do, we just want to make sure the time we're spending together, observers and teachers, is all geared towards helping growth, helping you get better at what you do so you can help your students get better and learn more effectively. And like to that, one of the most common things I will hear teachers say now is that, my principal came in afterwards and said everything was great, but they didn't see such and such pedagogy. So next time, can you do that so I can mark it off? Are you kidding me? I mean, how sad is that? Because it's a hoop jump. I know it's a hoop jump. And so I'm going to create something artificial the next time you come in. That's even if I know you're coming in, right? To make that thing. What does that have to do with anything? It doesn't. And so I know that's not really answering your question, because I'm not sure there is a definitive way to answer your question other than saying it's about growth, and risk-taking ties into that. And we have to create conditions for that to have it happen.
Yeah. And I think that's great. The way you just said that, that's actually, that is almost, I don't want to say always, that is almost always the way my formal evaluation years go. Recently they come in once, in the first part of the year, check some boxes. I explain how I'm doing all of the things on the list. I judge by tone of voice where the principal does not want to check a box, and I make sure that they know that I think they should, but then I'm like, I'm cool with it, because I know that the next time they come in, I'm just going to do that thing. Right. And in the end, it's going to be fine. I know how to do, this time around it's differentiation. And I'm like, well, yes, I do this, but it was not done as formally or as obviously as you would have, so that you can check the box of this lesson. That's fine. I know how I'm going to knock it out of the park next time. It's no big deal. But to your point, that doesn't necessarily lead to growth. And this is an idea that I said at random. I think it was in the episode with Beth Kinkoski. I forget, it was a while back, episode 12 or 13. It was early doing this podcast. And she and I were talking about how kids worry so much about grades or their test scores, and how if you look at some of these students on paper, they look incredible. But when you actually talk to them, you read the writing, you do the stuff, you go, well, the kid's just pretty good, right? And I think it's the difference between like being, say, a great professional athlete and a great fantasy player. Like right now it's fantasy football season, right? I have some guys who are putting up crazy points, but they're terrible for their team. Their team isn't winning and they're not helping the team win, but they're putting up the stats. And I think that sometimes the kind of evaluation you're talking about trying to get away from is really that idea that it sets you up to try to jump through the hoops. Like I'm trying to check every box. And so on paper, I look like a great teacher, but maybe that process didn't actually make me a great teacher. It just made me look like it on paper. I'm a fantasy star, but maybe I'm a dud on the actual team,
That's a great analogy for it. And it's silly because why are we doing this work, right? We're doing it to make a difference in the lives of kids. So then let's make every action we do about that and stop this, throw this stuff out. It's a waste of time. Sure, we can play the game well. You can play the game. I can play the game. But to what end?
Yeah. Do you think like how much of this do you think translates to the student experience? Because this is very much how things go with kids, especially I'm thinking about the kids in my AP classes. They say, just tell me what I have to do to get an A, and they will do it. I mean, I could walk on hot coals, read War and Peace, like something, they'll just do it, but in the end, doing it doesn't necessarily mean they've learned a ton unless I'm very careful in how I construct that. And, and so I'm very careful. I'm very thoughtful about the planning and the materials I'm using so that even if all they're trying to do is scan me for an A, they couldn't get it without having done the learning along the way. And I put way more time into that planning, those kinds of things. But do you think that the way we evaluate students, it could use maybe some of the same improvements that you're trying to make for the evaluation of teachers? Like, I mean, how does that factor in? Because I'm hearing a lot of parallels.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say this. I would say overall, I mean, we're not rating every single thing. I mean, with some rubrics, I suppose you could say you are, but I would take the way that we give feedback to students over the way we give feedback to teachers any day. But I think if we're talking about like the ratings, or you're checking whether you do or don't have that in Virginia, and we're equating that to grades, I think they both have a tendency to get in the way of real learning, right? So if I'm playing that game so I can get sufficient, so I can make sure I keep my job, that's getting in the way of learning. And if I'm worrying about the grade, then that's getting in the way of learning. And certainly, the conversations are going on all the time about should we be grading or shouldn't we be grading, and how do you avoid that? And I think really until we get universities to make a change and say that they don't need that, and maybe it's more a narrative or something like that, and I don't have the answer for that. But until you get the university to do it, how are we going to be able to get away from it easily? Well, certainly in high school. Middle school and elementary, I think you can get away from it more easily. But and that's where mastery comes in. Or I don't know. I don't have all the answers, but yeah, I agree with your point exactly that the grade for students, the evaluation for teachers gets in the way of learning.
Yeah. And sometimes it becomes a distraction, and I don't think you can remove it. Like, feedback is essential to learning. Like it's an essential part of the communications process. I can put it out and put it out and put it out, but if I don't ever get anything coming back to tell me, did it stick, or, can you do it? You have a broken down process. And so you can't remove the feedback, but maybe the way we communicate that, whether it's through grades or the rubric for teacher evaluation, there's definitely room for growth in the process, which obviously should be focused on growth in itself. Now that we're thinking about, not just improving the teachers, but maybe thinking about some of the grading and things like that, given your experience at a lot of different schools and a lot of different settings, what do you think is the ideal school? If you were given a budget, and think of it as private school, charter school, little state regulation, as long as kids are learning and not being hurt, you can do whatever you want. What do you think would be an ideal school, or at least something that's much, much better than we do now? Like what would you like?
I mean, look, and I agree with it, that the model of going from class to class and all these individual things that are separated and not connected into these bigger projects about learning and that are giving us chances to interact with each other it's like, I agree with that, but I don't have the exact answer for how to create some kind of a model that's all about learning. And I know there's schools that are out there that are probably doing that. I just haven't really spent enough time with them or studied them enough to know what those are. But I would say, I would get rid of grades for sure. And I would make it about learning, and I would make it so universities accepted that off the bat. So if we take that off the table, then it can just be about learning.
Yeah. And college admissions drives a lot of the lesser things we do in high schools, for sure.
No, it does for sure. And so then if it can become about learning, then I think it becomes then all those power skills. I think then we're really, really working on that. And certainly, look, all the stuff with equity, like Absolutely. We have to fix that. We have to take care of all of our students, and we have to find ways to be more successful and look at ourselves and see whatever issues we have with that. And so absolutely, that has to be a part of what we're doing. I think in addition to that, though, I think like in terms of my faculty, because I think that's really important, I think growth mindset, absolutely. A trusting, collaborative environment where teachers are leading each other in the professional development communities. I think that's really big. I think there's certain factors like just passion. Like if I could hire my ideal staff, they would all be passionate, not just about their content, but about making a difference in the lives of teachers. We've all seen those teachers that are like, well, but what if I don't get my content in? I don't really care about that as much as making a difference with these kids. And one of the most powerful things to me, and it I don't know if it still is, but the Teach for America rubric, they used to have a relentlessness. And that just resonated so deeply with me that I am not giving up on you. And I want every teacher to have that with every single kid. And that means something different for each and every kid, right? Like my son is really smart. And so he can go up there and put on a presentation that some teachers will sound just great, but like my favorite teacher that he had recently was like, Craig, come on, that's not your best. That's not even close to your best. You're just throwing out generalizations, and called him on that because that's what he needed. Where another kid, they might not be doing that. They might be doing their best. And so that differentiated piece tied to that relentlessness would absolutely be it. And so I think if we're talking about all those things and then the care and those power skills, then I think that social emotional piece automatically factors in, because really, what are we trying to do with schooling? It's the same thing that I feel like my job is as a parent. It's trying to create people that will be successful out in the real world, successful in personal relationships, successful in work relationships. I mean, I don't want to go into politics because I could go down a whole nother road with that. and so I'm going to stay there, especially right now. But if we can do that and create compassionate people, then I think we're being successful. And so all of those elements would be it. I don't know exactly how that manifests exactly into my dream school, but those are key elements that I would want.
Yeah. I mean, well, it sounds, it sounds like it's an answer that makes sense given both your experience as an administrator and also your focus on evaluation. Because it sounds like your ideal school would be a school in which you got to handpick the best staff, like moving into a school. Well, right. But you move into a school and you say, well, all right, I got somebody else was the principal before me. I got to deal with whatever messes they had. And you got to deal with the staff that's there. Even if you had the opportunity, say, in the real world to just hire a staff out of nowhere, you're always limited by your applicant pool. So, sure. I think it's an interesting idea to say that the ideal scenario is just to be able to draft people from whatever other schools that, you just, let me just steal the best school, teachers. Right? Yeah, no, that's it. And it's funny. I didn't know which way you're going to go with it. You're talking about the teacher. I'm like, he's gonna pick the best teachers from the surrounding 15 schools and create the best school around because he has the best staff. But as a guy who's focuses on evaluation, I think that makes a lot of sense. If you get the right people in there, if you think about it, a lot of the problems that we have in schools, I don't know that you can blame them all on individual teachers, but I think a lot of them do manifest as a result of the way, a school might function or teachers do and don't work together. So, I don't know if it fixes every problem we have, but you probably fix a lot of them by improving the overall quality of the teachers in the building and the way they work together.
No matter what school it is, that's what I'm trying to do, right? That's what Trust Base is trying to do. And that's what I hope we all want to do. And the other thing I'll say is, like I said earlier, is that like handpicking who I thought would be the best teachers, that probably wouldn't be the best school. Because some of those people might not, they might be the best classroom teacher, but they might not provide every other thing that makes a school successful. They might not be the people that coach, that do the extracurriculars, that the one that you can always go talk to that teacher because they've got that. I mean, certainly some of those people are, and maybe even have ego issues that come in if you have, if you had a team of all pros, doing the sports analogy, there'd be problems with that. So.
Yeah. It's right. Yeah, it's true. I mean, it requires some balance, and I certainly don't know how you handle that with a school, where the staff was already there when you get hired as the principal. I certainly don't know how you would do it starting from scratch. because at least then you don't even know how to predict the problems. Like, at least when you come into a school, you can ask around, how's this been going? What do you think of that guy? Like when everybody's fresh in the building and it's all new, that would be tricky. Uh, so, all right, I have one more question about stuff you said, and then we'll do the books and the movies. But you mentioned action research a few different times.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got my master's in teaching at James Madison University, that was something they actually had us do. That when I learned about it, I thought this is a cool idea. And then they said, we want you to do this while you're student teaching. And I almost instantly, hand went up and I was like, so you want us to evaluate our own best practices when we don't even have practices, right?
That doesn't make sense.
And I think the idea of it was good, is that they wanted to instill in us the idea of evaluating yourself, of actually looking at the data, and all of that's good. And it probably created some habits of mine that I still do. However, the actual practice of it was kind of a joke, because in the end, like, I'm just constantly trying to do something that is hopefully okay, hopefully
as
good.
A new teacher,
as a student teacher, whatever. But we did it, and I've never forgotten it. I've never gone through and done a full action research project, right, to present data and do the rest. But it did create, like I said, some ways that I think about it. How important is that process, or how formal are you with that? Because you use the word a few times. And so if you're asking teachers to do that self-evaluation, to look at the data, to look at, the work they're doing, is that something that's done informally? Is that something that you think teachers should be doing, should actually be collecting the data and doing the analysis? Like, how do you interpret that? This is the first time I've talked about action research since I finished college. So I'm just curious, like, how do you think that should be implemented? Because no one's ever talked about it to me since I left school.
So I think really what I'm talking about is that, like, we're focusing on one area of pedagogy that I want to grow on off of, like, it doesn't have to be the areas that are on the trust-based rubric, but for the purposes of the conversation, let's just say it's one of those areas. I've evaluated myself and noticed that there's an area that I think I can do. And so then I'm going to choose something within that pedagogy that I want to get better at specifically. And then we're going to be in the professional development community. So we're providing training and support amongst a group of teachers that have all decided they want to get better in that, right? So it's already supported in that way. It's already supported in the way that every time I come into your class, the next day I'm asking you about that. And I know what it is because I've got that written down as well. But then in terms of, like, the research, assuming you're not a first-year teacher, is going to be, look, there's some subjectivity to it. And so I'm either comparing it to maybe the same units I did the year before I was using this strategy, or I'm comparing it to maybe units earlier in the year before I did this strategy. And then we're constantly talking about it and getting feedback on it. And then we're seeing how we do. Like, when I've seen it done successfully, and I can't tell you every single time it ends up successful, but even so, if we're taking risks, eventually we're going to have success, is my belief. And so, like, one of my teachers chose to add Kagan cooperative learning structures into her, and she chose just two basic structures to add into her math. And so the kids would have a chance to interact and work with each other more than they did where they were independently solving problems. And so the first time she did it, when she compared her results to the same unit the year before, they were over one grade average higher. And look, we realize there's limits. So this group of students is different than last year's group of students. And so you have to allow for that. But when you're talking about one grade, that's clearly telling you something. And then she did the next unit and she noticed they were just like the same or just barely above. And she was really frustrated with that. But again, because we asked them regularly about it, like, you think about the goal setting normally where we fill it out in September and then May, the principal tells you we're going to talk about that at the end of the year. And oftentimes you're going, oh, right, what were those goals? And then, right, we're constantly.
Oh, crap, let me go back and look at what right, can I print off?
Usually you're locked out because you've worked on it anyway without being aware of it consciously. But this way it's conscious awareness, because every time I come into your class, we're talking about it and you're working on it in your professional development community. And so then with this particular teacher, what we saw was she had done it every lesson, and then she dropped back to only did it like 2 or 3 times the whole next unit. And so then the next one she realized and added it back in every single time again, and boom, she was back up to a grade again. And so that's really what we're talking about. So to me, it seems fairly informal in terms of the way we're measuring it against something else. And look, I don't really recommend this, but you could choose to do it with one class like if you're a high school teacher, one section and not another section, like the control group part of that to me feels a little bit icky, but there's different ways you can choose to measure, and then you see what happens, but you're being supported the whole way in the growth of your new practice. And I think that's where we're building in success and hopefully growth mindset at the same time as you're doing an action research plan.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And that, I mean, that's very much, I'm probably both a little bit because I'm an English teacher and I just try to avoid the data piece sometimes. Like I look at test scores, I look at test scores in great detail. Like I do think there's a place for standardized testing. I think we could do less of it or do it better, the target a little better. But I look at some of that data a lot. But I'm always thinking that way. I personally believe if you're not getting better, you're getting worse. Like there are very few things in life. You don't get to stand still very often. It's like you're in the ocean in a strong tide. You're always moving in or out. And so the minute you think it's good enough and you stop trying to get better, I promise you just got worse. And so maybe by keeping people focused on those areas of growth, it's big. All right. So I lied because I thought I had a question written down I wanted to ask you before the book thing. And I just realized I missed this. And then I promised this is the last one. Where do students fit into the evaluation piece for teachers? Like I do an evaluation form at the end of every year. I have a questionnaire students fill out anonymously. I read them over the summer. I actually calculate some average ratings. They tell me about me compared to their other teachers, the class compared to other classes, and then each of the major units, and they rate them. Yep. And I look at it, and I mean, a lot of times I can predict what they're going to say, but sometimes I get some really good feedbacks at the bottom. It's tell me anything you want. But that's not something that's required in my school. I don't think most schools require it. When you're thinking about the teacher evaluation piece, how often do you ask students what they think of their teachers? Or do you think there's a place for that in the formal evaluation process? Like, should students have a voice in that evaluation?
It's a great question. So I'll tell you, certainly trust-based observations doesn't talk about the kind of formal survey, anonymous survey that you're talking about. And I think it's a great idea. And it's an incredibly vulnerable thing and a brave thing. And I applaud teachers when they do that. And so we can come back to that in a second. I would say one of the things where we use the voice of the students in terms of teaching and learning and trust-based observations is on the observation template. So one of the things we have on the observation template is your learning targets. And there's different elements to that. But it's not just about my teaching, right? I could be teaching, but if the students aren't learning, then what does that mean? I could tick off all the boxes and maybe my students aren't learning. And so just a little way that we're able to get a little sense is there's a student interview during that it's a 20-minute observation, and just quietly going up to a kid and say, could you tell me about the learning target? And could you give me an example of a way that might be manifested in your work or whatever. And so we try and ask at least 2 kids. Sometimes it doesn't work out. And we don't take it in and of itself as like a be all end all, because look, there's some kids that are going to struggle more in general and some kids that are going to get it. And so you look at it, but it's information we share with the teachers. And oftentimes they'll do their own self-assessment of that. And so we add that into that. But I think it's a really, really interesting question that you're bringing up about, should students' voice factor into someone's actual evaluation? And in terms of retention or not, I don't know whether it should do that. That's because kids can be mean and not always have the best intentions, but using it for your own self-analysis, like what you're talking about, Ryan, to think about what you did, and you have to take it with a grain of salt. And I know no matter how we do things, at least for most people, like we can get 90 good ones and it's that one bad one that just
I always tell them guys, I'm like, you got to be honest. Like, you're not putting your name on it. I always tell them I don't read them until July. So by then I have forgotten all of your handwritings, unless it's the worst handwriting in the room, in which case I'm not judging you and I'm not grading you anymore. So you have nothing to lose here. And I actually tell them, I'm like, if something isn't good, you have to tell me. Like that. Yeah. That's the important. Like, I love to look at a paper that has straight 10s down the sure. line, but I'm gonna be honest. The one that has a bunch of 9s and 10s, and then there's a 5 in there.
Yeah,
like, that's actually the thing that that's the reason some of these other ones are 10s is because someone else told me that was a 5 last year.
No, absolutely.
And when it's I say hard, that, they really, and they do it, and I think carefully about it. I don't know. I was just thinking about it because if we think of the students as the people we're trying to serve, and if you want to evaluate the quality of like a waiter or waitress, it's not just the manager looking in, did you do all the things that we want? Did you stick to the script? Did you offer the specials? It's, did you have a good experience here? And that, I feel like that's got to be part of it, but you're right. It might be difficult to measure or whatever else. I just think, more often than not, kids will be honest. Like if you say, what was the quality of the class? Did you learn?
Yeah,
and then did you like it? Because I tell them too, like I have them rate everything twice. Did you enjoy it? Did you learn from it?
Yep.
And I don't care if they didn't enjoy it, if they learned a lot from it.
Yep.
But if both the numbers creep, I go, I don't know. I just, it's something I've never seen done, but I always feel like maybe kids could have a bigger role in that.
I think you have a really good point. And I certainly think if you're in classes as much as you are with trust-based observations, you're going to get a feel for it because you're around kids enough to do that. But it sounds like for the second edition, I have to add new chapter.
Well, I apologize for doing that to you. All right. So we're going to wrap this thing up. So you get a couple of books, couple of movies that you would recommend to just people. It could be school related or just personal enjoyment. What are some things that you think people should check out? And then, of course, if there's anything we missed, you want to clarify, you can toss it in there as well. You get kind of an open mic here, but what are some things you'd recommend for the listeners to check out?
All right. So this is just pure fun for me, but the new Borat movie was hilarious.
I just watched it like 2 nights ago. Yeah.
So I'll have to tell you, because you've got young kids though, when I'm renowned in my family now, I have boy-girl twins who are 18 and they're kind of deferring because of everything right now. But I was renowned growing up for like wanting my kids to see meaningful movies, but misjudging how old I should show them to them. And the worst one is they were in 5th grade. And this is so bad. I'm really embarrassed to share this, but oh well. I thought, let's show the kids The Killing Fields.
In 5th grade.
So like one of the very first scenes, there was an explosion like right outside the cafe or at the cafe, and like tears, and it was like, oh, whoops. And that's my most notorious example of being really bad as a dad with good intentions, but apparently really bad perception about.
That's hilarious. That's good.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So and then the other thing I'll tell you is that in Tacoma, which is my hometown, it's about 200,000 people. We have an art house cinema, but the only way it can make it is functioning as a nonprofit. And so that means all the concessionaires and the ticket takers are all volunteers. And so prior to COVID, I would volunteer once a week at that, which is so much fun. And then it's the art house cinema, so you get a free pass every time you go and free popcorn. And so I do miss that because the people there are great. But 2 movies from 2019 that I thought were absolutely amazing were the Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, the one where Tom Hanks played.
I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah. And it's really about a reporter, I want to say from Vogue, but I could be wrong where he was from, or Esquire maybe, who went to go do a piece on Mr. Rogers because he was going to take him down. Like that he wasn't really the guy that he was. And then it kind of follows him actually eventually realizing that, no, he really is.
I'm a huge Mr. Rogers fan, by the way. I own all 3 of the World According to Mr. Rogers, like little quote, but like I'm a huge fan.
There were those.
Oh yeah. It's great. It's like little segments of speeches and things that he said in letters and shows. And they're great, like gifts too, because they're small, they're hardback. You can read a page. You don't have to read the rest of it. I have them. I keep them in my classroom, and once in a while, I'm having a bad day or I feel like a kid needs to read something nice. I just flip to it. I'm like, here's what we got. Yeah. So I have not seen that yet, but I will absolutely check it out.
Have you seen the documentary they did on him?
Which one? There's the one that was done by like
just a couple of years ago. 2 or 3 years ago.
I saw one where it was his neighbor, like a little kid, or a kid grew up next door to him. The summer house or something.
In the movies, like I want to say 2018, maybe, or 17 or 18. So it was just, I wish I could remember the name of that one. But oh my, like at the art house cinema, they actually had a high table outside the door to the theater. They're smaller theaters because it's art house, with boxes of tissue. And we would just say, just grab one now. You'll thank me later. And
I'll look it up. I may have seen it. Like I've seen a couple documentaries on the guy. I just think he's a remarkable person. But I have not seen the Tom Hanks one yet. So I'm glad you recommended that.
No, so both of those.
That might be this weekend. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the other one was Jojo Rabbit.
Oh, I don't know that.
Okay, so that was a boy in World War II, and he was German. And his imaginary best friend was Hitler. And so It's dark but it's quirky and very funny and sad and moving all at the same time. And the kids and I saw it like we saw it multiple times because we liked so much. My wife just watched it like on Netflix 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, that's so good!" And anyway, it's highly, highly recommended. So those are my movies.
All right. Rock and roll. All right, I'm writing it down to make sure, because that one, I feel like now I'm like, the name sounds familiar, but none of the description does. So that could be a
Best
fun
Picture
one.
nominee. I know for.
Okay, so maybe like I feel like I've heard of it, but I don't know anything about it. So that maybe that makes the list here as well. Got to check.
Don't watch it with your kids though.
No, I try to I try to put them in bed and then say leave me alone. No,
Don't pull a Craig.
Yeah. We got into the Avengers a little too. I've never been a superhero movie thing. My kid got into it, like his friend at school was, and next thing you know, he's 3 and we're watching these, and I'm like, some of this is not for a 3-year-old. And I'm like, just crossing my fingers that he's actually so young that he doesn't even understand what's happening. Like I don't know, but we're gonna hit a window where you're not gonna be allowed to watch these again for a while. Like I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. So we got a few strong movie recommendations there. Anything else that we either missed in the discussion that you want to clarify, you want to add to anything? Recommendations?
You want to do books? A couple of books?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah. Definitely.
Anything else? No, I feel like we're good on everything else. So I'm just gonna. I try not to read like I did so much research for the book that like I'm just not really excited about reading education books right now, and I feel like I need something to get away from it.
I'm actually glad to hear that, because anytime I hear someone who tells me they're excited to read education books, I'm immediately suspicious.
I mean, there's some great ones out there. For
There are
trust-based observations. Of
course. One exception, of course. There's one right, you should be excited.
That's right. And I'm going to recommend one for all teachers out there, though, and it's a Parker Palmer book called The Courage to Teach. And he really just lays out what it's like to teach in a way that just makes you go, I always thought that, and I always thought it was just me. And he has this great quote, and I'm paraphrasing, where it's just like something along the lines of, I went to school that day, like on top of the world, because feeling like I'd nailed it and had teaching down. And I came home that night frustrated with my kids, frustrated with myself for the horrible way I taught that lesson. And I went to bed that night thinking, at this age, do you think there's another job I could get to do? Maybe something I'm even good at? And it's like, because teaching is so hard, right? And it's so unpredictable that we all have moments like that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. That's, usually I'm only serious about looking for other jobs when I hear they're thinking about not giving me my step increase for the following year. I talk about it in general a lot, but I always tell my wife, if you ever actually see me looking for a job, it's probably because I heard I'm not getting a raise next year. Like but there's plenty of days that cause you to at least think about it. That's for sure. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's just the nature of teaching. It's hard. Okay. So I'm going to recommend one novel, and it's called The Vanishing Half. And I'm blanking on the name of the author, but it is, I'll just give you a little teaser. It's basically, there's a town in Louisiana. This is a fictional town, but it was started by a guy after the Civil War, and he was a very light-skinned Black man. And so he would only recruit people to come to his town who were light-skinned Black people, thinking that over time we could become white enough that we won't be treated as badly, we could be treated. And so that's sort of the premise. And then there's these 2 sisters, and one ends up going into the world passing as a white person, and then everything around that in the 2 sisters' lives. And it's fascinating. That's
cool. That's a cool concept. Yeah.
It's a really
half. Yeah. And the title now, of course, makes a lot of sense. It's good.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Nice. I will check that one out. I've not heard of that. That could be good too. All right. So we got a teaching book. We've got a novel. We have the evaluation book, Trust-Based Observations by Craig Randall. Which to be totally honest, I need to find a way to like bring this up with my administrators, because I think they do a great job. So I need to find a way to be like, hey, you should check this out, without it being check this out because it's better than what you do. But it might be a check this out because it's a thing worth considering. Maybe there's something there. Gotta find the right way to bring that up, especially during my evaluation year. You always got to be nice. You got to bring in some extra baked goods and stuff. Well, Craig, I appreciate you taking the time to talk. I got a lot of great information, I think, about about the evaluation process. And I think you have a great outlook on keeping it focused on growth. Not to beat the metaphor to death, but that whole, fantasy stud versus the actual team player, the person who's producing on the field. I might fit this nicely, because it sounds like you're lining things up that really focus on actual effect and actual productivity, not just maybe checking the boxes that make it look like we are. And as you pointed out with your ideal school, recommendation, maybe a big part of improving schools is really getting the right people working in them and helping those people to do their jobs as well as they can. And if observations can facilitate that, then they certainly should. And I think we're probably both in agreement that up to this point they have not been, or at least not doing it as well as they could be. So for anybody who's listening, make sure you check out Trust-Based Observations. I will link to it on the website at ClassCast Podcast. Craig, how can people get in touch with you if they want more information or they'd like to engage?
Yeah, so you can get the book on Amazon. I have a website, www.trustbased.com. My email is craig@trustbased.com. My Twitter handle is @trustbasedcraig, noticing a theme there. And I'm in LinkedIn as well, just Craig Randall there. And so those are the best ways to get a hold of me.
That's right. And
please
you have
reach out. I'm happy to help anybody.
Very good, consistent branding. So in case anybody had any doubts, this guy knows what he's doing. This is smart. This is good stuff. All right. Well, this has been the ClassCast Podcast with Craig Randall of Trust-Based Observations. You can find the ClassCast Podcast at www.classcastpodcast.com, on our web app at listen.classcastpodcast.com, and streaming on all major platforms, including YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, et cetera, et cetera. Craig, thank you again for talking today. Hope everyone has a good day.
Thanks so much for having me on, Ryan. I really appreciate the opportunity.